Inside the E92 M3, the specific model is a 2013 competition coupe with a slick dash and a slick top. Now, for many of you, me included, this was a dream car. As a kid, I lusted after having a high revving, naturally aspirated V8, made it to a manual transmission and rear wheel drive. This car was literally on my wall. And I will say this, when you get into one of these for the first time, you might be a little underwhelmed because most of this cabin is regular 3 Series, which does take away from some of its specialness. I know that's one of the problems Mark has with these cars is, despite what was an enormous price tag, it doesn't feel remarkably special till you actually drive them. Now, let's quickly talk about some of the modifications and the key ergonomic points. Your driving position in this car is tremendous. Now, the BMW performance seats that Matt has put in this car has helped that a lot. They're some of the best seats I've ever been in. They're really just recovered or modified Recaro Sportsters, but that doesn't take away from their specialness. You sit nice and low, and you have great visibility in this cabin. He has some dine-in pedals, which aid in the fact that this is one of the best cars to heel and toe in. Your steering wheel feels great. It's now Alcantara, and your shifter falls right to hand. The rest of this cabin, though, is, again, regular 3 Series, which means it's easy to live with, you have a reasonable sized trunk, and you have a back seat large enough for people you don't like. So with that, let's head into Obsessed Garage and get this thing up in the air.
We are back at Obsessed Garage with Matt, the owner of this lovely E92 M3.
It's pretty dialed in.
It's hard to argue the purity and beauty of this car. So tell me, one, why you bought it, and then tell me what you've done to it, because I know you've owned several.
Yeah, I've always wanted an M3. I wanted an E36 when I was 16, 17. I wanted an E46. I almost went to the dealer 6 or 7 times. I think I was making 40 or 50,000 bucks, and the payment was like 900 or something like that. That's when I was driving a Civic, and with the aspiration of either an M3 or an S2000. And I finally got one in my early 30s. Not this car, but the same variant of that car when I turned 30 in 2010. And so I got my M3, and I think it's the M3. I think the E92 is it's the most flawed, but also the most special, car to me.
So I got to ask you, right? So how many E92s have you owned?
2.
Okay, so with the car collection that you currently have, and this is something that we discussed off camera, when you have a GT4, GT3 RS, you have some serious cars that you've been through. You got rid of an S2000, you've gotten rid of so many cars, but why would you come back to this E92? Like, what is its staying power after you've been in all this other?
It's special. I think the seating position. I'm a big sucker for steering feel, even though I'm not a track guy. But something about the way where you sit. Obviously it's not 911 good, but it's a usable car. I can put my kids in the back. I can drive the family in the car and have them be somewhat comfortable, even though it's a coupe. The induction noise, you get that. It's like the perfect balance. I don't know that there are many cars that have ever existed that have the healthy combination of induction and exhaust noise. That sort of V8 growl. But you have the high revability, and you hear the intake. The GT350 is a great sounding car, but you get no motor and all exhaust. And so I just think, although those are 2 very similar cars, I actually sold the GT350 to go back to an E92 M3. Okay. Even though it's inferior in every measurable way to a GT350, it's just I don't know, it's the right size, it's the right sound, it's the right amount of output. I just think it's great.
Okay. So let's get underneath this thing and see what he's done to it.
So Mark, we're underneath yet another BMW M3. This is an E92.
Yes, we've already done a long video, over 40 minutes, and nothing has really changed. This is a 2013 model year, the same as mine, or my old one rather. But Matt has sprinkled in some of his favorite pieces of flair that make this the ultimate M3, or at least for his sensibilities.
So, quick crash course on the car. High revving V8, 8,000 RPM redline. In this case, manual trans, rear wheel drive, strut front suspension, multi-link rear, and this does have some bespoke M components like the front subframe, some of the control arms, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, the cooling, the front bumper, the wide body, all the things that they did to M cars.
Carbon fiber roof.
Right. So the things that he's changed here that somewhat fixed my biggest deficiency with this car is the brakes. He did Brembos in the front
And in the rear.
and they are way bigger than the single piston caliper that was on here that was just a joke.
And in this car, they are tremendous. And then
Yeah.
he did full dyno suspension. So it still has the adaptive damper function, so you can still control the ride control, the
yeah.
EDC module, but this thing does ride extraordinarily well. Sadly, because we're in Florida and all the roads are straight, you can't really tell what this is doing to limit handling, but it still maintains a like stock ride quality.
The ride quality is really good, and we'll talk about that during the drive, among other things. But I've noticed there is changes to the sway bars on this car as well.
Yep, dyno stuff.
The ride height has also been adjusted to the maximum he can lower it. It does look extremely low, but this is a car where it looks natural. It looks normal.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's dumped 2 inches off the ground. And in the rear mark as well, the big thing you're going to notice, and this is something we're going to talk about in the drive, a lot of the attention to detail he's done towards this car is for sound. He has, he's not chasing necessarily speed with this build, but it's the mix of induction noise and exhaust noise. So he did a Venturi front, basically intake manifold or intake plenum and intake with a scoop in the front. And then in the rear, he's on a full dyno exhaust with 4 resonators and a catalytic converter delete. So it does have this really great mix of front engine noise and rear exhaust noise. And this also was tuned from I believe the tuner was EES or ESS. They've done some subtle engine modifications as well with tuning, so it makes slightly more horsepower. He thinks it's somewhere in the almost 400 wheel horsepower range.
So the S65 in this, much like the V10 version that we talked about, still has the same tried and true issues that if you lack the funds or the know-how to do the proactive like rod bearing service and throttle actuators, that's one of the big watch outs. And this car is now increasing in price since we did the last video. The values of them are up significantly.
So this is a 13, no real damage to it, never been in a real accident, yada, 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 clean car, and it's probably now like a $50,000 buy. However, you can get earlier ones now, and it used to be the low 20s for the high 20s, and clean cars are extraordinarily expensive.
But I think that's a good time to take this out on the road, and we can have a debate about what makes this good and not so good before we get into the final thoughts.
All right.
Jack, when you told me we're going to do another BMW and I was shaving this morning, I literally cut myself with the razor. So please tell me what we're doing in here.
So we're going to have a little bit of an argument, but first, I'm going to show you why I love this car.
Couldn't happen to be anything to do with the engine.
Oh, maybe. When you uncork this engine, it sounds phenomenal.
All right, so there's a big difference between this car and the one that I owned. And we talked about it in the shop, the additions of subtle things like the exhaust and the intake, or the intake manifold or whatever. It sounds better, but it also sounds faintly familiar, Jack. Why is that?
Well, some may know I have a rather affinity for the GT350, and this sounds like a GT350. It's missing like an octave or some of the harshness you find when you bring it all the way up to 8,000 RPM found in that car, but a lot of the specialness still exists.
Yeah, if you close my eyes and you put me in here, and I didn't know what interior was, I would think it's a GT350, just more muted. And I think it's that V8 sound. But the big thing that I'm going to say before I get into the things that I don't like about this is, yes, this is a special car. It's a special engine. You have a manual gearbox, individual throttle bodies. This has to be one of the best throttle responses, at least the way that this is set up. It is mind-blowing how quick the throttle response is. So I'm gonna put on the artificially enhanced, and I'm gonna have you do a couple downshifts. The blips are unbelievably fast. It's like instant, like on and off switch. So that is my favorite part about this, It is the right engine in the wrong car.
And see, this is where you and I are going to disagree. I think this is the right car. As someone who owns a dedicated two-door sports car, I can't take it anywhere. I can't go to the grocery store. I can't really drive it. Because it's not a flexible car, I don't end up driving it. It sits all of the time. You could drive this every single day. It's still a 3 Series. You can put your least favorite people in the back seat when you have to. You have a trunk. I mean, because it's usable. But to you, this is like a Honda Civic, right?
I just see it's got almost the sports car thing going for it. It's got a great engine, good transmission. It gets horrible fuel economy.
Yeah, 12.7.
It doesn't feel special on the inside. It doesn't feel like any different than a 3 Series, but everything is very functional and usable. But at this point, I would rather have a car that has less running costs, less risks, that is a sports car, not a sedan trying to be a sports car, and then have something that I'm not getting 12.7 miles to the gallon, and I'm not having that. I'm not having enough fun in here. I never did, even my own car. It wasn't the best handling car, even though it was neutral. The brakes were horrible, which he's remedied here and probably paid like $7,000 for.
$11,000.
Okay, and this is the thing about it. You know, if you're going to get a sports car, get a sports car. This just isn't enough. But I will say, because this is so special and so rare, that doesn't mean that it's not a great car. This is something that's going to be a collectible. And if you're in the place where you're on the fence about buying one of these, you have to buy it now before they get out of control in terms of cost. They'll be super rare with 1 million miles on them, because this is going to be a collector BMW. It's one of the best BMWs I've ever done.
You don't like that it's compromised.
Yeah, I don't like that it's too compromised.
And because it's compromised, I think this car is special, because you can use it all the time. What do you think about the dynamics, though? You don't like the steering? I don't like the gearbox, but what's wrong with the way this thing handles?
The gearbox, the shifter feels like a piece of plastic. There's no weight to it. It's not connected. The body it just feels like, it feels like a boat. It's like it's a 3 Series with a big ass engine in it, a great engine, and everything else feels very mundane.
Would you be happier if this was a Z4M with this V8?
Yes, if it was in a purpose-built sports car, which BMW doesn't have aside from the Z4, that's BMW's problem. They don't have that like pure car where an engine and like this mindset would work. So every M car is like, well, it does a great job on the street. You always have to make that excuse for why it's compromised, and that's why I'm not a huge fan of these cars.
To you, it's a wannabe car. You've always said that.
Yeah, it just feels like a wannabe sports car. And again, numbers, we talk about M cars, new M cars, they're astounding how fast they are, but you're not left feeling a whole lot.
The problem I have with those cars and why they're not that memorable is the engine.
Right.
This has...
And those cars are way faster than this. But you know what I mean? This, like...
Speed isn't that important, though. We talk about that all the time. I'd rather have a car be slower, like a 458, versus the 488, because of the sound.
Yes, and... Okay. So you are buying this car purely based on its engine.
Yeah.
Could we agree on that?
Yeah, I mean, Matt spent basically $100,000 on this car for this.
For it to sound like a GT350?
Exactly. So, with that, Mark, let's head into the final thoughts.
All right. Final thoughts on the E92 M3, and a big thanks to Matt from Obsessed Garage for allowing us to use his car to do this video, as well as that crazy Civic Si that we did that he's doing a giveaway on, so check that out at Obsessed Garage. Now, the big thing is, I've already done a video on this. I've owned the car, I've been through it, I've moved on, but Jack has a good point. The big selling feature of this, it's more of a timeless BMW design, it's gonna be a collectible, and you can use it 7 days a week if you so choose, and you understand the risks and costs associated with driving a car like this every day, from fuel economy to potential engine issues if you don't take care of rod bearings, throttle actuator. Everything's gonna be more expensive for this car. That's it. And my ownership experience was flawed. It was in the shop for about 2 months, and I only had like 8,000 miles on it, and to me, there's just no excuse for it to be stranded. It's one of the few cars that I was stranded in, so of course, I'm jaded. But let's say you don't have any issues. Let's talk about the pros and the cons. The engine is amazing. We beat that to death. The transmission, the fact that it has a manual trans is great. It doesn't feel the best. It's definitely the most plasticky of the BMWs I've driven. It's rear-wheel drive. The car is extremely balanced and neutral. You have to be a dummy to stuff this car. It's not a wild vehicle. You can really get used to it and grow with it. And the fact that it doesn't make a lot of torque means it's way easier to understand the dynamics of it. If this vehicle's on your short list to own, buy it now before it gets crazy expensive. You're gonna love the engine. You're gonna love the car, the way that it looks. It's way more timeless than what's coming out right now. But I'm gonna leave it at that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.